Thank you for your kind welcome. Thank you for the provocation from my twin brothers as well. It's a joy to be here as an elder brother. I still feel a little bit underused in that when Calvin was a few years younger than me, he had already completed his first draft of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. I sadly completed my studies in theology in Oxford, and that's probably been one of the damages. I studied Zwingli, and I live in Zurich. And as a similar source of the Reformation, capitalism had one of its forces in Zurich with systematic preaching. In 1519, a little before Calvin started to write the Institutes, Zwingli started to preach systematically through the Bible. And I think that's one of the sources of what we have in Switzerland today in the way of a thoroughly thought-through Reformation. So I'm going to redeem my years and hopefully only spend a few moments with you. Having gone from theology and survived a few years in banking, I was then called almost audibly to start a company called King's Curry, which started as a small Indian restaurant in 2002 in Zurich. And we've just opened the 6th restaurant in Basel, so it's growing in the right direction. And this was something which my theology studies and my banking studies certainly did not give me anything to really equip the team that I worked with. And there were some things, though, which were laid down as seeds during my theology studies, which I'd like to share with you today. 3 things. 1, creativity. 2, critique. And 3, capital. I'll share these 3 points with examples from Calvin's life. First of all, creativity. I was talking with a restaurant owner in Geneva today, and they said, "Oh, it's very sad, these Calvinists in Geneva. They look sad, and it's a very sad city." And there was a celebration missing. I don't think that's what Calvin was about. Calvin starts his Institutes of Christian Religion just glorying in the goodness of our Creator God. He says, every single plant that grows, every blade of grass, every color is an encouragement to rejoice and praise the Creator. That doesn't sound like a grumpy person to me. And perhaps we have lost some of that joy in our churches. We have lost some of that joy in the diligence of the Reformation. How does that work itself out? We teach all of our staff who join us that we serve a Creator God. And that is one of the greatest joys, going back to one of the points that we were earlier taught about, communication and education. It's vital. We have platforms, whether that's a friendship platform or a commercial platform or an education platform or a church platform. Do we choose to communicate the goodness of our Creator? And it took a step from a theological education to a banking foundation to actually say, how do you combine these? And how do we communicate it to the people we have, not just in a business plan which you can submit to a bank, but in a spiritual plan for the business? What were the foundations that we wanted to build a company upon? And we said first was Genesis 1:27. We wanted to demonstrate to people, and we work with Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, atheists, Catholics, Protestants, these fundamental biblical truths in the sense of, yes, we serve a God who's created such a good world that we can even tell our employees that Indian food tastes good because of the creation. And we can share our belief in the very first training meeting we have with them. And we only have 50 staff at the moment, but I do seriously believe that the Lord's been patient with us until we've dealt with these responsibilities in a responsible manner. So creativity. We looked at the Lord's creation and we were allowed to celebrate Indian cuisine with joy. That's the motto of King's Curry, to celebrate Indian cuisine because of the goodness of God's creation. We also go further and we say that everybody is created in God's image, and that's something which is shocking to people who come from caste structure in India. So there's something creative but critical in us explaining that men and female are made in God's image. There's something which is creative in allowing staff to be trained up and perhaps coming in as a refugee into the company, but eventually being trained up to be a chef de service. And we've seen that the spiritual courage in doing that has paid off economically as well. Secondly, critique. While we can revel in the glory of God's creation in whatever field we are in, Calvin also reminded us that from the mother's womb, we were all master crafters of idols. We were all idol makers. And he was preaching to a Christian society. How much more so in what some people call a post-Christian society. We've become idol makers par excellence. And that's backed up biblically as well with Psalm 51. We were conceived in sin in our mother's womb. How do we redeem that? Partly through the accountability structures that my honorable forebear mentioned. And how do we bring that into an organization? One small example is we realized that cash was going missing from the till in the first year. And it was up to us to put in place a control mechanism that instead of trusting the staff, we actually put a website together which recorded the daily revenues. So we withdrew the opportunities for sin within the organization. And that took an unpleasant process of discovery and critique. How true is that in a company? How much more so in a country? I'm really looking forward to a time when the church is again encouraged by the reformers, semper reformandum, always reforming, to preach again in a fresh way to a fresh generation the message of Jesus. I was so encouraged to realize that occasionally when I speak to school platforms, very few people have heard the gospel message for the first time. Whereas perhaps in my parents' generation, they have become inured to it. There really are opportunities to tell people about Jesus for the very first time. Thirdly, going into capital, probably not as we've been watching Michael Moore's film Capitalism recently. What did Calvin mean by capital? He started with his Institutes of Christian Religion by concentrating on a theological communication between God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But he ends, at the end of the fourth book, with a chapter on civil magistrates, which sounds like a very strange place to end, government. And what does capitalism have to do with that? I think that Calvin understood the importance of spiritual capital. And I'm so encouraged to see very many friends and respected elders of the Reformed and Christian and evangelical communities here, because there's so much spiritual capital in the room tonight. And that is a sign of encouragement for being able to use the creativity and the critique to build spiritual capital for the future, just as we mentioned building the schools in Geneva earlier. What does that mean, perhaps from a business perspective? It's not just saving profit and ensuring that a company is properly capitalized, but rather, as Calvin said, to use the gifts that we are given to edify the church and our neighbors. Unless we're blessing our neighbors, we are not wealthy. We're not wealthy financially or spiritually or intellectually unless we are overflowing. We were told to go back to the roots, to the foundations. And going back to the roots, as the Renaissance Benedictine monks talked about, was going back to Jesus, who is the font of living waters. Never runs dry. So I'd like to end with an encouragement by sharing a small example of King's Curry. We're a profit-making business. It's written into our constitution that we give 10% of our profits away to mainly Christian charities in India, but also the spiritual capital that we build up in each of our employees, seeing people making a commitment in their lives to Jesus, seeing people who have a nominal Christian background growing forwards. They say that a reformation happens when the embers on the edge of the fire are brought into the center of the fire, and the logs in the center of the fire are burning brightly. So I very much hope and pray that this weekend will be a rekindling for many people to take new ideas, new expressions of continuing reformation back to wherever you've come from, that you will be stimulated to become more creative, more critical, and to build up and share more capital. And I do also covet and request your prayers that we will become better stewards of spiritual capital in King's Curry and in whichever other platforms we have to share. Thank you so much for listening, and I will just hand over to my beloved father.